In the domain of public discourse and interpersonal debate, there exists a fundamental and pervasive fracture between the rigors of sound reasoning and the art of persuasion. We generally operate under the comforting assumption that an argument's strength lies in its adherence to truth and the solidity of its evidence. We believe that if we marshal our facts correctly and link them with valid logic, victory should naturally follow. However, a close examination of the mechanics of argumentation reveals a starkly different reality. The problem facing any student of logic, or indeed, any citizen attempting to navigate the currents of politics, media, and academia, is that the efficacy of an argument often bears little relation to its validity. The world is awash in arguments that sound plausible, carry the weight of authority, and move audiences to action, yet are structurally rotten or linguistically deceptive. The core of this problem is not merely that people make mistakes. To characterize these lapses as simple errors is to underestimate the complexity of the landscape. The issue is that there is a systematized arsenal of logical counterfeits, fallacies, that mimic the patterns of sound reasoning so effectively that they pass unnoticed by the untrained ear. These are not random stumbles. They are specific, identifiable maneuvers that allow a speaker to pass off a conclusion as proven when it has essentially been smuggled into the room without paying the toll of evidence. The central problem I address here is the mechanism of this deception, how the structure of logic and the ambiguity of language are exploited to detach persuasion from truth. To understand the magnitude of this problem, one must first appreciate the rigid demands of formal logic and how easily they are subverted. In a valid argument, the conclusion follows inexorably from the premises. If the building blocks are true and the blueprint is sound, the resulting structure must stand. The formal fallacies represent a corruption of this blueprint. They are the structural engineers of deception. They present a facade that looks like a valid syllogism, the classic three-line argument, but which contains a fatal flaw in its internal architecture. Consider the pervasive error known as affirming the consequent. This fallacy strikes at the heart of our understanding of cause and effect. In valid logic, if a specific condition leads to a specific result, the presence of the condition guarantees the result. However, the reverse is not true. The presence of the result does not prove the condition. Yet, in the chaotic arena of debate, this distinction is routinely obliterated. We see an outcome, a broken treaty, a falling stock market, a convicted criminal, and we instinctively look backward to a single cause. If a specific policy would cause the market to fall, and the market falls, the political opportunist leaps to the conclusion that the policy was the culprit. This is a structural failure. It ignores the vast multiplicity of alternative causes that could produce the same effect. The problem here is that the human mind craves simple causality. We want to believe that because the sidewalk is wet, it must have rained, forgetting entirely that street cleaners, burst pipes, or garden hoses exist. The fallacy effectively closes off the universe of possibilities, forcing a singular, often unjustified, connection between events. A similar structural failure occurs when the direction of causality is reversed or negated improperly. The fallacy of denying the antecedent operates on the illusion that preventing a cause will inevitably prevent its effect. This is the logic of the false security blanket. It assumes that if we avoid the one thing we know causes disaster, we are safe. If smoking causes premature death, then not smoking promises a long life. The structure implies a guarantee that reality does not offer. By eliminating one threat, we do not eliminate all threats, yet the argument persuades us that we have. These formal fallacies are dangerous because they retain the rhythm and cadence of valid logic. They sound like proofs. They use the language of therefore and because, masking the fact that the bridge between the premise and the conclusion has collapsed. The problem deepens when we examine the structure of the syllogism itself. A valid argument requires a bridge, a middle term, that connects the subject to the predicate. In the fallacy of the undistributed middle, this bridge is built only halfway. It relies on the sloppy overlap of categories. It posits that because two different things share a common feature, they are the same thing. This is the logic of guilt by association and the bedrock of prejudice. If tyrants are efficient, and a particular manager is efficient, the fallacious structure invites us to brand the manager a tyrant. The logic fails because the shared quality, efficiency, does not cover the entire class of either group. It leaves ample room for efficient Democrats and inefficient tyrants. Yet, in the heat of argument, this gap is glossed over. The audience hears the repetition of the shared trait and accepts the identity of the two groups. The rigorous exclusion of overlap required by logic is replaced by a loose, associative haziness that serves the purposes of those wishing to smear or elevate without justification. Beyond these structural cracks, the problem of argumentation is compounded by the inherent instability of the medium itself, language. While formal fallacies corrupt the blueprint, linguistic fallacies rot the materials. Words are not static entities with fixed, immutable values. They are fluid, carrying multiple definitions, nuances, and emotional associations. The fallacy of equivocation exploits this fluidity. It uses a single word in two different senses within the same argument, acting as a pivot point to swing the debate in a new direction. A word like free, for instance, can mean liberated in one breath and without cost in the next. By sliding imperceptibly between these meanings, an arguer can construct a chain of reasoning that seems solid but is actually disconnected. The deception lies in the continuity of the sound of the word, which masks the discontinuity of its meaning. This is not merely a pun. It is a fundamental breakdown of communication where the concepts being discussed are swapped out midstream. This linguistic slipperiness extends to the structure of sentences themselves. The fallacy of amphiboly arises from careless grammar that creates ambiguity. A sentence might be constructed in such a way that it can be read in two entirely different ways. The oracle or the politician thrives in this ambiguity, creating statements that can be validated regardless of the outcome. If the prophecy is that a great empire will fall, the prophet is safe whether the enemy's empire crumbles or their own. The problem here is the abdication of clarity. The argument does not pin down reality, it dances around it, leaving the audience to project their own hopes or fears onto the blank screen of the ambiguous statement. Furthermore, language allows for the manipulation of emphasis to alter meaning without changing a single word. The fallacy of accent occurs when the stress placed on a particular word shifts the implication of the sentence. A prohibition against doing a specific act might be twisted by stressing the method, implying that other methods are permissible. A statement of fact can be turned into a statement of irony or skepticism purely through vocal inflection. In print, this is harder to detect but no less potent. By quoting an opponent and italicizing words they did not emphasize, a writer can distort the original intent, making a reasonable statement sound hysterical or a specific claim sound like a universal generalization. The problem is that the text of the argument is not just the words, but the way they are delivered and perceived. The fallacy smuggles in implications that were never argued for, relying on the audience's tone deafness to the manipulation. The deception of language is not limited to individual words or sentences. It extends to how we group and categorize the world. The fallacies of composition and division represent a failure to distinguish between the collective and the individual. We routinely assume that what is true of the parts must be true of the whole. If we gather the best players, we assume we will have the best team. This ignores the emergent properties of the group, the chemistry, the leadership, the coordination, which are not present in the individual members. Conversely, we assume that the characteristics of a group must apply to every individual within it. We judge the individual by the average of their class, stripping them of their unique attributes. This is the logic of stereotyping, where the statistical abstract is forced onto the concrete reality of a person. The problem is a simplification of complexity. We treat fluid, complex systems as simple aggregates or distinct individuals as mere slices of a collective pie. Underlying these specific mechanisms is a broader, more insidious problem: the use of language not to describe reality, but to shape the audience's perception of it before an argument even begins. The use of loaded words is a prime example of this. By choosing terms that carry heavy emotional baggage, an arguer can shortcut the entire process of persuasion. A customized label can turn a public servant into a bureaucrat or a freedom fighter into a terrorist without a shred of evidence being presented. The words themselves do the work of the argument. They prime the audience to accept a conclusion based on the emotional resonance of the labels rather than the facts of the case. This is a corruption of the very purpose of descriptive language. It turns the lexicon into a weapon, where the definition of terms becomes the primary battlefield. The problem is that once the terminology is accepted, the argument is often already won or lost. We also face the issue of how precision, or the appearance of it, is used to mask ignorance. The fallacy of false precision dresses up vague or unmeasurable concepts in the garb of exact numbers. We see this in the obsession with statistical exactitude in social sciences or opinion polling, where distinct human preferences are quantified to decimal places that have no basis in reality. This creates an illusion of scientific rigor. It persuades the audience that the speaker possesses a level of knowledge and control that is impossible. The problem is the reverence we hold for the trappings of science and mathematics. We are easily cowed by a percentage point, forgetting to ask whether the underlying concept can be measured at all. This blinding with science is a tactic of authority, using the jargon and the aesthetics of expertise to silence dissent. The landscape of the problem is further complicated by the way arguments are structured to exclude the middle ground. The fallacy of bifurcation, or the black and white fallacy, forces a choice between two extremes when a spectrum of options exists. It presents the world as a binary system, friend or foe, victory or death, total success or abject failure. This is a powerful tool for polarization. It eliminates nuance and forces the audience into a corner where they must accept the speaker's preferred option or face a terrible alternative. The problem is the artificial restriction of the field of debate. It denies the complexity of the real world, where most solutions lie in the gray areas between extremes. By framing the debate as a binary choice, the arguer creates a bogus dilemma, trapping the audience in a logic that is valid only within the artificial confines of the options presented. In this initial survey of the problem, we see that the failure of public and private discourse is not merely a matter of people disagreeing on the facts. It is a matter of the machinery of argument being rigged. The formal structures of logic are mimicked to create a veneer of validity. The fluidity of language is exploited to shift meanings and smuggle in assumptions. The complexity of the world is reduced to binary caricatures, and the emotional resonance of words is used to bypass the intellect entirely. We are surrounded by arguments that beg the question, assuming the very things they claim to prove. We face circular reasoning where the conclusion feeds back into the premises, creating a closed loop that is impervious to outside evidence. We encounter arguments that are irrefutable not because they are true, but because they are constructed to allow no foothold for objection, moving the goalposts or redefining terms the moment a challenge is raised. The problem, therefore, is one of vulnerability. Without a clear understanding of these mechanisms, the audience is defenseless. We are prone to accept the conclusion because we cannot pinpoint exactly where the process went wrong. We feel the force of the therefore, even if the path leading to it was paved with equivocation and structural error. We respect the numbers, even if they measure nothing. We fear the terrible alternative, even if it is a fabrication. The first step in addressing this state of affairs is to recognize that these are not merely bad arguments in the sense of being weak. They are deceptive arguments in the sense of being counterfeit. They mimic the shape of truth to peddle falsehoods. They are the weeds that look like wheat, and they have overrun the field. Having established the nature of the structural and linguistic traps that constitute the problem, the way logic is mimicked and language is twisted, we must next turn our attention to the driving forces that make these fallacies so effective. We must move from the how of the deception to the why. Why do we fall for them? What are the psychological levers, the emotional intrusions, and the unwarranted presumptions that allow these structural defects to take root in our minds? This inquiry leads us deeper into the territory of relevance and the specific causal mechanisms that sustain the empire of fallacious reasoning. Before we move on, please subscribe to our channel, Deep Thinker, and hit that like button if you enjoy self-improvement content. Also, don't forget to share this with your friends and family. Alright, let's get back to it. If the problem of argumentation lies in the structural and linguistic fractures that separate persuasion from truth, the cause of our susceptibility to these errors is far more intimate and unsettling. It resides in the psychological machinery of the human mind and the ease with which irrelevant material can intrude upon our judgment. While formal fallacies exploit the architecture of logic, and linguistic fallacies manipulate the ambiguity of words, the vast majority of effective deceptions operate by bypassing reason altogether. They succeed not because they mimic a valid proof, but because they appeal to something stronger than logic: our emotions, our prejudices, our deference to authority, and our intellectual laziness. The cause of the widespread failure of discourse is found in the domain of relevance, specifically, in the intrusion of irrelevant emotional material, the omission of necessary evidence, and the presumption of facts not in evidence. These are the informal fallacies that turn a debate into a contest of will, status, and sentiment. The primary engine of this causal mechanism is the intrusion of emotion into the sphere of reason. In a strictly logical exchange, the feelings of the participants are immaterial to the truth of the proposition. A fact remains a fact whether it is stated with rage, sorrow, or indifference. However, the effective sophist knows that the audience is not a calculating machine but a collection of desires and fears. By introducing emotional material that is technically irrelevant to the argument, the speaker can short-circuit the critical faculties of the listener. The argumentum ad baculum, or the appeal to force, serves as a brutal archetype of this intrusion. It replaces the mechanism of persuasion with the threat of consequence. When a speaker intimates that a particular view should be accepted to avoid unpleasant repercussions, whether physical violence, social ostracism, or economic ruin, they have abandoned the argument entirely. The cause of the acquiescence is not conviction, but fear. The logic has been superseded by a primal survival instinct. This is not a failure of understanding on the part of the audience. It is a forced derailment of the reasoning process. A softer, yet equally corrosive, form of this emotional intrusion is found in the argumentum ad misericordiam, the appeal to pity. Here, the cause of the audience's sway is their own empathy. When a defense attorney urges a jury to acquit a client not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the client has suffered a tragic childhood or faces a bleak future, they are committing a fallacy of relevance. The suffering of the individual, while tragic, has no bearing on the factual question of whether a specific act was committed. Yet, this fallacy is devastatingly effective because it exploits the human reluctance to appear cold-hearted. We confuse the moral virtue of compassion with the intellectual virtue of accuracy. The speaker successfully creates a situation where rejecting the argument feels like a moral failing, thus bullying the intellect into submission through the heart. This manipulation extends outward to the collective psyche in the form of the argumentum ad populum. This fallacy locates the cause of truth in the sheer number of its adherents. It exploits the herd instinct, the deep-seated human need for belonging and validation. If the majority believes a proposition, the individual feels a powerful pressure to conform. The demagogue bypasses the need for evidence by appealing to the common man or the will of the people, treating popularity as a proxy for validity. This is a reversal of the logical order. Facts are not determined by a show of hands. Yet, the ad populum works because it comforts the listener with the safety of the crowd. It suggests that 50 million people cannot be wrong, despite the abundant historical evidence that millions of people can be, and often are, simultaneously and disastrously mistaken. The cause of the error here is the surrender of individual judgment to the consensus of the mob. The intrusion of irrelevant material is not limited to the emotions of the audience. It often targets the identity of the opponent. This is the domain of the ad hominem fallacies, where the argument is ignored in favor of an attack on the arguer. The cause of the deception here is a confusion between the source of a claim and the merit of the claim itself. In the abusive form of this fallacy, the speaker heaps scorn and insult upon their opponent, hoping that the mud will obscure the validity of the opponent's case. If we can classify the messenger as a fool, a scoundrel, or a hypocrite, we feel justified in dismissing their message without the hard work of refutation. This is an efficient, if dishonest, cognitive shortcut. The circumstantial ad hominem is perhaps even more insidious because it masquerades as a reasonable analysis of motives. It suggests that an opponent's view is merely a reflection of their self-interest, employment, or social standing. By asserting that a person only holds a view because they are a priest, a union leader, or a business owner, the arguer creates a disqualification based on circumstance. The cause of the fallacy's success is the cynical assumption that no one speaks the truth objectively, and that identifying a potential bias is the same as disproving a contention. It creates a closed loop where no argument from a vested interest can ever be valid, ignoring the reality that even self-interested people can be correct. Closely related to this is the fallacy of poisoning the well, which represents a preemptive strike against the integrity of the opposition. By framing the debate in such a way that any dissent is evidence of moral depravity or stupidity, the poisoner ensures that the audience is inoculated against the opponent's words before they are even spoken. Only a traitor would oppose this bill, effectively silences the opposition by attaching a stigma to the very act of arguing. The cause of the silence is not the strength of the bill, but the social cost of the dissent. A distinct branch of these diversionary tactics involves the appeal to authority, or rather, the appeal to false authority. The argumentum ad verecundium exploits our respect for achievement and status. In a complex world, we must rely on experts, but the fallacy occurs when we import authority from one field to validate a claim in another. The cause of this error is the halo effect, where we assume that because a person is a brilliant physicist or a celebrated actor, their views on politics or religion possess a similar weight. We allow the prestige of the individual to overwhelm the specific requirements of the evidence. This deference is further manipulated by the opposing fallacies of ad antiquatem and ad novitem, which appeal to the authority of age and novelty, respectively. The conservative mind is seduced by the notion that the old ways are best, equating longevity with correctness. The progressive mind is ensnared by the belief that the new is inherently superior, confusing innovation with improvement. In both cases, the cause of the belief is a prejudice regarding time, rather than an examination of the proposal's merits. While emotional intrusions and diversionary attacks explain much of why we abandon logic, a separate and equally potent set of causes lies in the realm of presumption. These fallacies operate by smuggling in proven assumptions into the very structure of the argument. They force the audience to accept a premise that has not been established, often by hiding it within the conclusion or the question itself. The most notorious of these is the petitio principii, or begging the question. Here, the conclusion is merely a restatement of the premise in different words. "We must ban this activity because it is prohibited," is a circular loop that creates the illusion of momentum while remaining stationary. The cause of its success is the density of language. If the rewording is sufficiently complex, the audience fails to notice that they have been sold the same horse twice. The argument relies on the listener's implicit acceptance of the very thing that is supposed to be under dispute. This presumption of truth appears more aggressively in the complex question, plurium interrogationem. By asking, "Have you stopped beating your wife?" the interrogator presupposes a fact, that the beating occurred, and demands a binary answer that confirms the guilt regardless of the response. The cause of the deception is the entrapment inherent in the sentence structure. The listener is forced to accept the hidden premise in order to answer the surface question. This technique is a staple of entrapment, forcing the opponent to defend against an accusation that was never explicitly made but was smuggled in as a given condition. The human mind's desperate search for causality provides fertile ground for presumptuous fallacies. We are hardwired to look for patterns, to see connections between the thunder and the lightning, the planting and the harvest. This cognitive imperative leads us into the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, where we assume that because one event followed another, it was caused by it. The cause of this error is the confusion of sequence with consequence. We see a talisman rubbed and a fortune won, and we presume a causal link where there is only coincidence. This superstition is the bedrock of much political and economic discourse, where incumbents claim credit for prosperity that occurred during their tenure but independent of their policies. The fallacy satisfies our need for a coherent narrative, even if that narrative is a fiction. Similarly, the cum hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy confuses correlation with causation. When two events occur simultaneously, we are tempted to view one as the driver of the other. If gun ownership and crime rates rise together, the debate immediately polarizes into two causal camps, often ignoring the possibility of a third, underlying factor that drives both, or the possibility of pure chance. The cause of the error is an oversimplification of the complex web of reality. We prefer a simple, direct link to a messy, multivariate explanation. This reductionism is also evident in the fallacy of the slippery slope. Here, the arguer presumes that a single step in a particular direction must inevitably lead to a catastrophic slide to the bottom. If we allow X, then Y and Z will surely follow. The cause of this fear is the presumption of inevitability, the refusal to acknowledge that future steps can be halted or regulated. It turns a question of degree into a question of absolute destiny, paralyzing decision-making by conjuring a phantom disaster. The distortion of reality is further achieved through the fallacies of omission, where the argument fails because it leaves out critical options or context. The bogus dilemma, or bifurcation, presents a situation as a stark choice between two alternatives when, in fact, there are many. You are either with us or against us, erases the middle ground of neutrality, partial agreement, or alternative solutions. The cause of this fallacy's power is the artificial narrowing of the field of vision. It forces the audience to choose the lesser of two evils, concealing the fact that the evils were fabricated constraints. This manipulation of the conceptual landscape restricts the freedom of thought, herding the audience into a corral built by the speaker. We also see this mechanism of omission in the concealment of quantification. By failing to specify whether a statement applies to all, some, or most of a group, the arguer allows the audience to assume the most damaging interpretation. Mechanics are crooks implies a universal condemnation that is statistically supportable only if interpreted as some mechanics. The cause of the deception is the ambiguity of the generalization. The mind tends to essentialize. We treat categories as monolithic. The fallacy exploits this tendency by allowing the exception to stain the whole, or the particular case to masquerade as the universal rule. This tendency to generalize from insufficient evidence is codified in the fallacy of dicto simpliciter, sweeping generalization, and its converse, the hasty generalization, secundum quid. In the former, a general rule is applied rigidly to a specific case that has exceptional features, e.g., forbidding a desperate man to borrow a weapon because borrowing weapons is dangerous. In the latter, a specific, exceptional case is used to construct a flawed general rule. The cause of these errors is a lack of nuance, a failure to recognize that rules have exceptions and that individual anecdotes do not constitute data. We crave the certainty of the universal law and the vividness of the specific example, and we frequently misapply both. Finally, the cause of many argumentative failures lies in the diversionary tactic of the red herring. This is the deliberate introduction of irrelevant material to draw the hounds of the argument off the scent. When a politician asked about corruption launches into a patriotic speech about the resilience of the nation, they are deploying a red herring. The cause of its success is the emotional intensity of the distraction. If the irrelevant material is sufficiently stimulating, making us angry, proud, or amused, we forget the original question. We follow the bright object and leave the difficult truth behind. This is closely related to the straw man fallacy, where the arguer constructs a weakened, caricature version of the opponent's position and proceeds to demolish it. The cause of the victory here is the fabrication of the enemy. It is easier to fight a dummy made of dry grass than a real opponent. The audience, witnessing the destruction of the straw man, assumes the actual argument has been defeated, failing to notice that the real target was never engaged. In sum, the cause of the problem, the reason why invalid arguments win, is that they hijack the very machinery that makes us human. They exploit our fear, ad baculum, our pity, ad misericordiam, our desire to belong, ad populum, and our respect for status, ad verecundium. They manipulate our pattern-seeking brains into seeing causes where there are none, post hoc, and trap us in loops of circular logic, petitio principii. They restrict our vision through false dilemmas and distract us with red herrings. These fallacies are not merely technical errors, they are psychological masterkeys that unlock the doors of assent without the key of evidence. They work because they feel right, even when they are demonstrably wrong. They satisfy our emotional needs at the expense of our intellectual integrity. To understand these causes is to begin to see the architecture of the trap, but to escape it requires more than just diagnosis. It requires a strategy for resolution and a new framework for engagement. Before we move on, please subscribe to our channel, Deep Thinker, and hit that like button if you enjoy self-improvement content. Also, don't forget to share this with your friends and family. Alright, let's get back to it. To traverse the landscape of logical fallacy, to diagnose the structural fractures of formal logic and identifying the psychological manipulations of informal error, is to arrive at a necessary but insufficient plateau of understanding. Diagnosis is not a cure, nor is it a strategy for victory. Having engaged with the problem of deceptive reasoning and dissected the causes that allow it to flourish, we must now turn our attention to the solution. The solution presented by a comprehensive study of argumentation is not merely the avoidance of error, but the cultivation of mastery. It requires the transformation of a passive awareness of fallacies into an active, strategic capability. This capability is dual in nature. It serves as an impregnable defense against the sophistry of others and, more controversially, as a sharpened toolkit for those who wish to prevail in the rough and tumble of public debate. The ultimate resolution to the problem of argument is the development of a taxonomical precision that allows us to classify, neutralize, and, when necessary, deploy these mechanisms with intent. The foundation of this solution lies in the rigorous classification of error. We cannot defend against what we cannot name. The chaotic swarm of bad arguments that assaults us daily, in news broadcasts, boardrooms, and dinner conversations, must be ordered into a coherent system. By grouping fallacies into distinct families, we gain the ability to recognize their underlying DNA, regardless of the specific disguise they wear in a given moment. The first major category we must master is that of the formal fallacies. These are the errors of pure structure, the collapsed bridges of logic where the conclusion does not follow from the premises. To master these is to become a structural engineer of debate. When we encounter an argument that affirms the consequent or denies the antecedent, we do not need to engage with the subject matter at all. It matters not whether the topic is geopolitics or gardening. If the structure is rotten, the argument falls. The solution here is the cultivation of a mathematical detachment, the ability to look past the emotional content of the words to the rigid scaffolding underneath. When we see the scaffolding failing, we can dismantle the opponent's case not by disputing their facts, but by exposing their architecture. However, the battlefield of everyday discourse is rarely populated by the dry syllogisms of formal logic. The far more common threat comes from the informal fallacies, which require a different kind of mastery. We must become linguists of ambiguity, sensitized to the linguistic fallacies that exploit the fluidity of language. The solution to the problem of equivocation or amphiboly is a demand for rigorous definition. We must refuse to allow words to shift their shape mid-argument. When an opponent uses a term like rights or freedom in a slippery manner, the master of argument halts the proceedings to pin down the definition. This defensive posture strips the fallacy of its power, which relies entirely on the audience's critical acceptance of the shifting meaning. By forcing clarity, we force the argument onto the hard ground of reality, where linguistic tricks cannot survive. Beyond language, we must master the fallacies of relevance, which can be subdivided into those of omission, intrusion, and presumption. The solution to fallacies of omission, such as the bogus dilemma or the concealed quantification, is a relentless expansion of the context. We must constantly ask what is being left out. When offered two bleak choices, the skilled arguer instantly searches for the third option that has been hidden from view. When presented with a generalization about union members or conservatives, we must demand the quantifier. Are we talking about all, or merely some? This active skepticism is the antidote to the narrowing of vision that these fallacies seek to impose. We solve the problem by widening the lens, refusing to accept the artificially restricted field of vision presented by the opponent. For the fallacies of intrusion, such as the appeals to emotion, fear, pity, outrage, or the diversionary red herrings, the solution is a disciplined focus on the central thesis. We must develop an immunity to the emotional payload of the argument. When an opponent brings up a tragic anecdote or launches into a personal attack, the master of argument acknowledges the emotion but ruthlessly separates it from the logic. We must constantly steer the debate back to the question at hand. That is a moving story, we might say, but it does not prove the statistical claim you are making. This requires a certain coolness of mind, a refusal to be baited into an emotional response that would derail the reasoning process. The solution is to remain the adult in the room, the one participant who refuses to let the debate descend into a contest of feelings. The fallacies of presumption, such as begging the question or the slippery slope, require us to challenge the unstated assumptions that underpin the argument. The solution here is to drag these hidden premises out into the light. When an argument assumes its own conclusion, we must expose the circularity. When it predicts a catastrophic slide into disaster, we must demand the evidence for each step of the descent. By refusing to grant the unearned assumption, we stop the momentum of the fallacy. We force the opponent to do the work they are trying to avoid, the work of proving their foundational claims. But a true solution to the problem of winning arguments goes beyond mere defense. It involves the proactive and sometimes Machiavellian application of these principles. The study of fallacies is not just a shield, it is a sword. If the objective is to win, to persuade an audience, to carry a vote, to silence an opponent, then the judicious use of these very same mechanisms becomes a necessary skill. This is the uncomfortable truth that a complete education in argument must acknowledge. There are times when the rigorous logical proof is less effective than the well-placed metaphor or the emotional appeal. Consider the power of the analogical fallacy in offensive argumentation. While logically weak, an analogy is rhetorically devastating. If we wish to promote a new policy, comparing it to a universally admired historical event invests it with a grandeur it may not deserve. Conversely, comparing an opponent's plan to a known disaster tarnishes it by association. The master arguer knows that the audience thinks in pictures, not syllogisms. By providing the right picture, we can direct their thinking more effectively than by providing the right statistics. The solution to the problem of persuasion often involves bypassing the intellect to appeal directly to the imagination. Similarly, the use of the tu quoque, the you-too fallacy, is a potent offensive weapon. While it does not logically disprove an accusation, it effectively neutralizes the accuser. In the court of public opinion, standing is everything. If we can show that our accuser is guilty of the very thing they condemn, we destroy their credibility. The audience, sensing the hypocrisy, withdraws their support. The master of argument uses this not to establish truth, but to level the playing field. It is a tactical maneuver that clears the board of the opponent's moral authority. We can also employ the device of the straw man, not in its crude form, but with subtlety. By slightly overstating an opponent's position, or by focusing on their weakest argument while ignoring their strongest, we make our task of refutation significantly easier. The audience, rarely paying close enough attention to spot the slight distortion, sees a decisive victory. This is the art of selecting the battlefield. We do not attack where the enemy is strong. We attack where they are vulnerable, even if we have to help create that vulnerability ourselves. The ethical dimension of this solution is, of course, complex. To use fallacies to deceive is to abandon the pursuit of truth. But to use them to simplify complex issues for a lay audience, or to counter the deceptive tactics of an unscrupulous opponent, can be seen as a pragmatic necessity. The world is not a seminar room. It is a rough environment where the best argument does not always win. The solution, therefore, is not a puritanical refusal to engage with rhetoric, but a sophisticated understanding of how it works. We must know how to blind with science when necessary, using technical jargon to establish authority. We must know how to use the ad populum to rally the troops, appealing to shared values and common identities. We must know how to shift the burden of proof when we are on weak ground, challenging the opponent to disprove our assertions rather than proving them ourselves. Ultimately, the solution offered by this deep engagement with fallacies is the empowerment of the individual. In a society dominated by mass communication, advertising, and political spin, the person who understands the mechanics of argument is a sovereign entity. They are no longer the passive victim of manipulation. They can watch a political commercial and see the post hoc fallacy inherent in the incumbent's claims of prosperity. They can read an editorial and spot the false dilemma meant to stampede them into supporting a war. They can listen to a salesperson and hear the equivocation in the warranty. This mastery leads to a kind of intellectual fearlessness. When we know the names of the demons, they lose their power to terrify. We can enter any debate, on any subject, with the confidence that we possess the tools to dissect the opposition. We know that even if we are not experts in the specific subject matter, we are experts in the structure of the discussion. We can spot the red herring before it leads us astray. We can identify the ad hominem and refuse to take the bait. We can see the circular reasoning and demand a straight line. The final implication of this mastery is a shift in how we view the very nature of truth and consensus. We come to realize that truth in the social sphere is often a product of successful argumentation rather than objective reality. Consensus is built, not found. It is constructed through the skilled deployment of reasons, emotions, and rhetorical devices. By mastering these devices, we become the architects of consensus rather than its inhabitants. We gain the power to shape the debate, to frame the questions, and to determine the answers. In conclusion, the journey from the problem of deception through the causes of psychological vulnerability arrives at the solution of technical mastery. It is a journey that transforms us from spectators to players. The study of logic and its abuses is not a dry academic exercise. It is a survival guide for the information age. It equips us with the discernment to reject the counterfeit and the skill to mint the coin of persuasion. Whether we choose to use this power to defend the truth or to win the victory is a choice that remains with us, but it is a choice that can only be made by those who have first taken the trouble to understand the game. The ultimate victory is not just winning the argument, it is understanding why it was won.